Hello and welcome back. We just finished talking about the spinal cord in the last lecture, and this lecture I want to go ahead and talk about the autonomic nervous system. So I want to refer to this diagram here. This is one you've seen before in a previous lecture, and I want to reiterate a couple of things to you. Let me get my pen ready here. So the central nervous system is made up of the brain and spinal cord, as we've talked about before. And so we've done a separate brain lecture and we did a separate spinal cord lecture. So I want to talk about the peripheral nervous system a little bit more in this lecture, specifically the autonomic nervous system. Now the peripheral nervous system is made up of what we call the somatic nervous system. So let me get my highlighter here. So we have the somatic nervous system, we have the autonomic nervous system, and just recently in textbooks they've added an enteric nervous system. So let's talk about somatic for just a second. That's not the gist of this particular lecture, but it is going to be the point of another lecture later on. So the somatic nervous system is going to deal with things like your somatic and special sensory receptors. These are all throughout your body. The somatic receptors would be things with dealing with temperature, pain, touch, vibration. Your special senses would be things like taste, touch, hearing, and vision. All of those are going to utilize the somatic nervous system, and they're going to utilize the spinal cord and the cranial nerves to do those particular sensory tasks. So the central nervous system can command through the somatic nervous system the skeletal muscles, and they're going to use specifically somatic motor neurons. These are going to be under voluntary control, and again, that contacts the skeletal muscle. So the central nervous system can have direct contact with skeletal muscles through the somatic motor neurons, but also the sensory receptors all throughout your body can have direct contact with the central nervous system using the spinal cord. So we have another system called the autonomic nervous system that is going to be doing things with controlling glands, controlling the secretion of hormones from glands. They're going to be controlling smooth muscle tissue, cardiac muscle tissue, and different organs, different visceral organs. So the autonomic nervous system does have sensory receptors, and they are going to utilize the spinal cord and cranial nerves to sometimes send information back to the brain. The autonomic nervous system, the brain and spinal cord can use the autonomic nervous system to contact the body and control through the use of various neurons, motor neurons. They can control the body and control these glands and muscle tissue that is not skeletal muscle tissue. And so they do that through the use of the sympathetic and parasympathetic divisions of the autonomic nervous system. And that's what the whole thrust of this particular lecture will be on, is the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems of the autonomic nervous system. Okay, so again, they're utilizing cranial nerves and spinal nerves, spinal cord in order to do these particular tasks. Much later on next semester, we'll be talking about the enteric nervous system, and you have a whole plexus of nerves that are going to be contacting various points of your GI tract, and they're almost independent. So we have sensory receptors there that are part of this enteric nervous system. They can communicate to various motor neurons, which can cause activities to occur independent of the central nervous system controlling that, independent of the autonomic nervous system controlling that, really. So these sensors do send sensor information back to the brain, but it's a huge network of nerve cells that are independent of the spinal cord and brain that are inside of that are covering the GI tract. Okay, so again, we're not going to talk about this one. We're not really going to talk about this one too much after the next slide, but we will focus mainly on the autonomic nervous system in this particular lecture. This is just showing you the somatic nervous system because I want to kind of compare and contrast it with the autonomic nervous system. But in the somatic nervous system, we actually have motor neurons that are in the brain, that come out of the brain. They may utilize the nuclei in the brainstem, and use a cranial nerve to contact skeletal muscle cells, or they may go through the spinal cord, as in this indicating right here, use the spinal cord and then send through spinal nerves, send that information out to skeletal muscle. So they can utilize cranial nerves and they can utilize spinal nerves in this thing that we call the somatic nervous system. In this particular one, we're using motor neurons, we're using the neurotransmitter acetylcholine to contact these muscle cells and have an effect on them. In contrast, the autonomic nervous system is going to utilize ganglia. So let me show you how this works. So let's say that we have a message coming out of the brain, and we want to send that through the autonomic nervous system to have some effect on all of these effectors out here: the smooth muscle tissue, glands, cardiac muscle tissue, fat tissue. So the brain does contact these things through the autonomic nervous system. So in this particular one here, you can see that the brain is sending a command down. It's going to a nuclei in the brain. A nuclei is a collection of nerve cells that are going to be processing information. They then send through a preganglionic neuron. This little red fiber here, axon here, is called a preganglionic fiber. And so this particular nerve cell is sending out this information to ganglia that are inside of the body. So in the top one here, let me go ahead and decrease all the ink off this. So we do have collections of nerve cells that are going to be part of the autonomic nervous system, and they are called ganglia. And sometimes they're in the body, and they're just collections of nerve cells, and we'll talk a little bit more about them. The autonomic nervous system uses a preganglionic fiber to communicate from the brain to that ganglia, from the spinal cord to the ganglia. It communicates information, and the ganglia are going to have nerve cells that are going to process that information and then send out extensions. This would be a post-gangliotic neuron or nerve extension coming out, and those will go down and contact the effectors to cause them to have some activity. Of course, at the end here, you're going to have neurotransmitters that are going to be dumped out of there. Sometimes it's norepinephrine, epinephrine, or acetylcholine, and different divisions of the autonomic nervous system will use different neurotransmitters to contact those particular cells. Okay, so we're utilizing cranial nerves, and we're using spinal nerves and other kinds of nerves in order to contact the body and have it connected to the brain and spinal cord. Okay, so let's go ahead and we'll deal with some of these differences here. So up here we have the somatic nervous system. You can see that the somatic nervous system is going to have the cell bodies in the central nervous system, either the spinal cord or brain. These the extensions will come out and go right to the effector organs, which will be skeletal muscle cells in this example, and they release acetylcholine as the neurotransmitter that's released. The neurotransmitter is going to cause sodium channels to open up, and it's going to be stimulatory in its effect. So that's the somatic nervous system. The autonomic nervous system is divided into the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system. One way to think of these as being differently is the sympathetic nervous system deals with fright or flight. The parasympathetic system deals with rest and digest. Okay, so this parasympathetic is for resting state, sympathetic is for emergency state situations. So your body will automatically respond utilizing these various parts of the autonomic nervous system. So if you're resting, parasympathetic's in control. If you're stressed, sympathetic nervous system is going to be in control. So let's do sympathetic first. Sympathetic nervous system is going to have, generally speaking, it's going to have short preganglionic nerve fibers and very long postganglionic nerve fibers. They're going to contact things like, the various tissues in your body, glands, muscle tissue, and even the adrenal medulla. So your adrenal gland, the inner part of your adrenal gland, will be stimulated by the sympathetic nervous system. And the hormones that are released by these, or neurotransmitters that are released by these sympathetic nerve fibers, will be noradrenaline. You can see acetylcholine is used here, but noradrenaline is used for the effectors. We also have epinephrine that can be released by the adrenal medulla and become a hormone in a blood vessel and then go to its target organs. The parasympathetic nerve system is typically going to have really, really long preganglionic fibers and then really, really short postganglionic fibers. They're going to utilize exclusively acetylcholine as the communication neurotransmitter of choice. So that's what's going to be used by this. And these chemicals can be stimulatory or inhibitory depending upon the effector organ that it's contacting. Okay, so let's deal with the sympathetic nervous system first. So the sympathetic division is going to carry out what we call the fight or flight response. And it's going to, generally speaking, decrease digestive and urinary functions. It's going to heighten mental awareness and alertness, increase metabolic rate. It's going to activate energy stores. It's going to increase respiratory rate, dilate respiratory passages so you can get more air to your lungs, increase your heart rate. It's going to increase blood pressure so you can squirt blood more efficiently through your arteries, and it's going to activate sweat glands. Okay, so all of these things, and there's just a few of the things. So you can see the sympathetic division goes to all parts of your body, and it's going to heighten the alertness, awareness, and the response to frightening or dangerous situations. Okay, so it's going to utilize the spinal cord to do these particular activities, and exclusively. We're going to see that the parasympathetic nerve system will use a mixture of spinal and cranial nerves. Now, this diagram can sometimes be confusing to folks. So let me explain to you what it means. So we can see that there is the spinal cord here. So this is a spinal cord here. All through here is the spinal cord. Coming out of the spinal cord, there will be nerves that will take information to the sympathetic ganglia. So if you look right here on this edge here, see if I can get my pen right. So if you look right here, there are these little collections of sympathetic ganglia that extend down the whole trunk of your body. Now, it's not until T1 that we begin to send information from the spinal cord to those sympathetic ganglia. Okay, so this is called the sympathetic ganglia chain. It's like a chain of nuclei, which are collections of nerve cells that are going to be processors of this information. So you can see the information comes from the brain, and it goes through the spinal cord. It's going to go to the sympathetic ganglia, and then it's going to go out to reach the effector organs. Now, there are different ways that you can send this information. So on the left-hand side, which is this side over here, you're seeing that the information is going through spinal nerves to various kinds of effectors such as skin, blood vessels, sweat glands, fat tissue. And this picture is kind of deceiving because it doesn't just go off to the left-hand side, but these spinal nerves are also utilized on the right-hand side as well, going to sweat glands, blood vessels, adipose tissue and such. So this diagram is trying to make it a little bit more simplified for you, so you can see, generally speaking, it does use spinal nerves to send information out to all parts of the body, both on the left and right-hand side. And this diagram over here, this side over here is also represented on the left-hand side as well. Left hand in the way that I'm looking at it, right hand if you look at anatomical position. Okay, so you can see that there are sympathetic nerves. We'll talk about how those are formed in just a second. And there are also splanchnic nerves that the sympathetic nerve system uses as well, in addition to spinal nerves. So the sympathetic division can use spinal nerves, splanchnic nerves, and sympathetic nerves in order to innervate all the different organs that you can see there. This is just showing you a sampling of organs that this is innervating. So uterus, ovary, penis, scrotum, urinary bladder, adrenal glands, your intestines, lungs, heart, salivary glands, eye. But remember, it also contacts all of these things as well. You know, your skin, blood vessels, sweat glands, adipose tissue, erector pili muscles, and things of that nature. Okay, so it's a pretty sophisticated arrangement of contacting effector organs throughout the body. Note that the preganglionic fibers, the fibers before the ganglion are going to be short. Fibers after the ganglion are going to be long. Those postganglionic fibers are going to be really long. Notice that you use a whole sympathetic ganglion trunk, a whole line of ganglia to contact from the spinal cord to the effector organs, and it utilizes, you know, from T1 to L2. We're utilizing spinal nerves, and then we can actually use these sympathetic ganglion to contact the sacral regions of the body. Okay, so that's a little bit about kind of the anatomy of that. So, so the sympathetic chain ganglia, if you look at a cadaver, you can see the sympathetic chain ganglia here. This one's been false colorized, so you can see that. So you know you have the spinal cord, which would be right in this region, and then there's a sympathetic chain ganglia there. So these chain ganglia are used as nerve cells that are going to process information. So in this example here, we have, let me get back to my black pen. In this example here, we have a little transverse section of the spinal cord. So here we have the spinal cord. We have a neuron, a preganglionic neuron that's going out, and it's going to the ganglia, and it's going to utilize, so it comes out here. So let's see if we get this straight here. So it comes out and it goes through the white ramus, which we talked about last time, to the ganglia, so the ganglionic neurons. It then is going to, there's a synapse right there, it then becomes postganglionic, and it's going to go out through the spinal nerves in this particular example. So let me take the ink off that. Okay, so this is literally showing you how it can use the spinal nerves on the right hand side. So we have preganglionic neuron, it comes out, it's going to go through the white ramus, it's going to synapse, become postganglionic, and then it's going to go out to the spinal nerves to go to its effector organs. So that's how a sympathetic nerve cell can use the spinal nerves. On the left-hand side, though, you can see the preganglionic cell comes out. It goes to the sympathetic ganglion, and then it goes out through a different exit and becomes what we call a sympathetic nerve. So over here, this would be a sympathetic nerve extension as well. So remember, this is spinal nerve up here. This is connecting to the next ganglion in this whole chain of sympathetic ganglia. Okay, so that's a little bit of the anatomy of how that works there. So you can utilize spinal nerves, you can utilize sympathetic nerves, and all of these things will innervate the different organs of the body to have their activity. So you might want to go back and look at that spinal cord lecture and make sure that you know all these different things. So that you know spinal nerves, and that you know the different roots, ventral root, anterior root, or dorsal root, and make sure you understand that where we have spinal sympathetic nerves, spinal nerves, the white ramus, the gray ramus, which is right here, gray ramus. So those are things that you want to kind of go back and remember. Let's see if I can mark that a little bit better. So the white ramus and then the gray ramus is over here. So the collateral, sometimes when we utilize these spinal nerves, we can sometimes send information. So here we have the information coming out. It's going through the white ramus to the sympathetic ganglion, and then it's going all the way using a spinal nerve using a sympathetic nerve, it's going to collateral ganglion. These are collections of nerve cells inside the core of your body, and from the collateral ganglion, it then goes to some kind of effector organ. Okay, so let's look at that one more time. So here we're coming out. We're going through the white ramus to the ganglion, going through a sympathetic nerve, and we're going to the collateral ganglion. From that ganglion, we now become post-ganglionic, and we can go to the various organs of the body. Okay, so this is how the sympathetic nervous system sometimes innervates the visceral organs of the abdominal pelvic cavity. And the adrenal medulla is kind of a unique situation here. The adrenal medulla, you can see the preganglionic fiber goes out. It goes to the collateral ganglion, and then it goes to the adrenal medulla. Medullae would be plural, medulla, which is a sympathetic, it is part of the sympathetic nervous system and is a secretory organ for the sympathetic nervous system, and it's going to secrete the norepinephrine and epinephrine neurotransmitters into circulation. They become hormones, and they will circulate down and go to target organs to have their effect. Okay, so that's how the sympathetic nervous system is going to utilize the adrenal medulla. Sometimes the sympathetic nervous system uses what we call varicosities. Varicosities are going to be these, they're going to look like strings of pearls, but if you look at preganglionic fiber, goes to the ganglion, becomes a postganglionic fiber, that will actually extend down and go to, in this particular example, this is a collection of smooth muscle tissue, and smooth muscle tissue doesn't work exactly like skeletal muscle tissue, so you want to be able to drop neurotransmitter off in large areas around the smooth muscle tissue so that it will have the signal to contract or relax. Probably contract in most examples, but maybe relax in some. So if you look at these varicosities, they're just swellings that are full of the neurotransmitters or vesicles containing neurotransmitters, and there's a little extension and there's a swelling. But this is a way that you can get rid of a lot of, or to drop off a lot of neurotransmitter in a lot of different areas, instead of just having like one little area where you have a synaptic knob. This has multiple areas where you have these swellings that contain neurotransmitters. All right, I don't know where to put my face, so maybe I'll just put it way over here. So let me talk about adrenergic versus cholinergic receptors. So when you drop off norepinephrine or epinephrine or acetylcholine, there are receptors that we consider to be adrenergic or cholinergic. Adrenergic are receptors that respond to norepinephrine and epinephrine. And so NE is norepinephrine and E is epinephrine. And this is going to depend upon the kind of adrenergic receptors. Norepinephrine will stimulate alpha receptors, and you can look at the chart down here to see what alpha receptors are. Epinephrine is going to stimulate both of them, both the alpha and beta receptors. Cholinergic receptors are going to respond to acetylcholine, and that's where they'll get their activity from. So if we take a look, let me ink this off. If we take a look at adrenergic receptors, there are alpha 1, alpha 2, beta 1, and beta 2. And if you take a look, they have you the location right here. Alpha 1's widespread. The response is excitation or stimulation of metabolism. Mechanism, it tells you how it actually works. So in alpha 1, when it's stimulated, it's going to have an enzyme activation, and it's going to release intracellular calcium. So these different kinds of receptors respond differently. So even though you use the same neurotransmitter, different receptors will respond in different kinds of ways, which is kind of cool to think about. So for example, beta 2, these are going to inhibit or relax things like your bronchial tubes. So they'll make them, grow larger. So If for example you want to relax the bronchi, and let's say you have asthma and you want to relax the bronchi, if you are somehow able to inject medication into the bronchial tubes, this will be a beta stimulator, or you can have a beta blocker. There's all different kinds of medications that will respond differently to each one of these different kinds of receptors. Okay, so that's something interesting to think about, and something more you'll talk about when you get into higher level anatomy, or when you talk about it in, if you go to nursing school. They'll talk about different medications and if they're beta blockers, beta enhancers, alpha blockers. We also have, for cholinergic, we have nicotinic receptors and muscarinic receptors. Nicotinic receptors would be something like they're going to be things like the neuromuscular junction, where nerve cells are contacting muscle cells. But the parasympathetic nervous system can sometimes use muscarinic, and so they're just different receptors that respond differently depending upon the signaling that's given to them. This is just a comparison of sympathetic and parasympathetic, showing you that the preganglionic fibers are shorter in the sympathetic, longer in the parasympathetic. Sympathetic nervous system uses, for this synapse here, it uses acetylcholine, but for the synapses after that, they're going to use norepinephrine and epinephrine. Parasympathetic nervous systems always use nothing but acetylcholine, so they're going to be nicotinic or muscarinic, always using acetylcholine. Alright, now let's talk about the parasympathetic division. Parasympathetic division carries out rest and digest. It's going to decrease metabolic rate. It's going to decrease heart rate, blood pressure. It's going to increase salivation and release of digestive juices, increase digestive motility, so the movement of juices through your digestive tract. It's going to increase blood flow to the digestive organs, stimulate urination and defecation. So anything that you do at rest, parasympathetic nervous system is going to take over and do that automatically for you. Now, if you notice, the parasympathetic nervous system is going to utilize specifically the cranial nerves. So you can see it's utilizing cranial nerves here, cranial nerve number 3. It's going to utilize cranial nerve number 7. It's going to use cranial nerve number 9 and number 10. Number 10 is going to be the majority of it, though. That vagus nerve really extends out and contacts really most of your organs. It utilizes a few of the spinal cord, the spinal nerves coming out, and to contact some of the lower regions. So we're looking at mostly cranial nerves with a few of the lower spinal nerves that are coming out. So these nerve fibers extend out. They have very, very long preganglionic fibers, and then very, very small, short postganglionic fibers. They do use ganglion. You can see the ganglion are spread throughout the different regions of the body, located near the heart, near the lungs, near your digestive organs, and then they go out and extend to the actual organ. Okay, so you do want to kind of realize there is a difference between the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems in terms of the length. We really focused on the length of the fibers. So preganglionic fibers are short in the sympathetic nervous system, relatively long in the parasympathetic nervous system. Neurotransmitters released at preganglionic are acetylcholine in sympathetic and acetylcholine in parasympathetic. Those postganglionic fibers, though, are relatively long in sympathetic division, relatively short in parasympathetic, and we're utilizing norepinephrine, and then sometimes you'll use a gas, nitric oxide, or acetylcholine, but predominantly and exclusively acetylcholine in the parasympathetic nervous systems. So general function is something else we really focused on. You want to know about. Stimulates metabolism, increases alertness, prepares you for fight or flight, and then for parasympathetic system, promotes relaxation, nutrient uptake, energy storage, and is responsible for rest and digest. Okay, that's a really quick and generic and simplified overview of the autonomic nervous system, talking about the sympathetic and parasympathetic and some of their differences and similarities. If you dive into your reading, it's a very complex chapter, so I would encourage you to look at this and think about it. You might need to rewind a couple times and dive into your book a little bit and get yourself ready for your test. So I will talk to you later and see you in subsequent videos.